Michael Jackson ainda resiste, porque além de branco ficou triste. Bob Marley morreu, porque além de negro era judeu. Michael Jackson ainda resiste, porque além de branco ficou triste. Oh! Ai, ai, ai. Lá, lá, ia, lá, ia, lá, ia, lá, ia. Eu cá me ponho sempre a meditar, pela mania da compreensão. Ainda hoje andei tentando decifrar algo que li, que estava escrito numa pichação. E agora eu resolvi cantar.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope everybody had a good lunch break. I'm enjoying the live captions for the music that was playing. Okay, I wonder if we should give everyone maybe a couple of minutes to join back from lunch. In the meantime, just as a quick introduction to the next session, this is very much a story that prototypes how to leverage the domestic architecture or the home that was inhabited or built by the enslaved, and thinking about methodologies to read the buildings and ways of engaging with people who still live there to understand how the architecture might tell us something more than we're seeing. So the story explores the domestic architecture built and inhabited by the enslaved across the Atlantic, both as sites of resistance and adaptation to new worlds, focusing in this case on the architecture of freed Afro-Brazilian returnees in Brazil Lane in Accra, Ghana. The house has become a site of negotiation between the formerly enslaved and the new worlds that they have become a part of. So I think it's fine to jump in. As this is being recorded, I'm sure other people can recap the story later on. So this is the story of a home. It was born on Brazil Lane. Today, this street is called Brazil Lane in Jamestown, Accra, in 1836. And it presents an alternative outcome to the transatlantic slave trade. Whereas we saw in the beginning, the majority of journeys leaving the African coast to other parts of the Americas and the Caribbean and Europe, we see the opposite journey happening and the reintegration of the formerly enslaved, as well as the birth of a new family and community. The Brazil House is what it's called today, is recognized as the cradle of Afro-Brazilian men and women who came over 200 years ago to start a new life, taking advantage of the hospitality of the people of Gamashi. We know that of the estimated numbers of enslaved people that were transported between 1501 and 1866, an estimated 4.9 million Africans, about 40%, ended up in Brazil. In Bahia, northeast Brazil, where Brazil's sugar industry was thriving, I think we can go to the next, the enslaved population became home to a large, diverse population. Beginning in the 1800s, as high as 30% of the enslaved were African-born Muslims. And 19th century Bahia nurtured a strong collective resistance movement to slavery. On a Sunday in the Ramadan, on a Sunday in Ramadan season of 1835, a group of enslaved West African clerics in Bahia organized one of the best recorded slave rebellions in the Americas. Drawing participants from virtually every ethnic group, the revolt of the Males, which is the Yoruba word for Imali or Islam, of African-born slaves and freedmen in Bahia. It is estimated that 600 warriors took to the streets in Salvador. However, the revolt failed, believed to have been leaked to the authorities ahead of its scheduled start. And so after the failure, about 234 slaves were taken to court. Some of them were executed and others expelled to Africa. There was a further percentage who voluntarily agreed to journey back to Africa. And many of these comprised of Muslim Africans, about 500 of them were made the journey from Brazil to these African countries. You can go to the next slide. On board the British commercial steamship SS Salisbury in 1835, it is estimated that this formed one of many journeys that transported between 3,000 to 8,000 formerly enslaved to the African continent, settling in the coastal communities of Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and Ghana. Go to the next slide. So dressed in finely tailored coats, top hats, they were all fluent in Portuguese. These Afro-Brazilian returnees were skilled craftsmen, builders, architects, traders, tailors, farmers, among many other professions. And they used these skills to establish themselves and build a new life. In Ghana, the next one, they are known as the Tabon, derived from the Portuguese greeting "Está bom," which was their language of trade at the time. Among the range of skills and entrepreneurial practices, some of which were highly beneficial for the people, local people, including the digging of wells in urban coastal cities. Their fashion and textile tradition nurtured famous tailors and fashion houses like the Scissors House in Ghana. In Benin and Togo, they were known, and Nigeria, they were also known as the Agudas. In Togo, we know of the Afro-Brazilian political family, the Olympio family, who was basically, whose grandson basically became the president of Togo from 1945 to 60. In Nigeria, they settled in an area known as Popo Aguda today, and we see evidence, and most prominent evidence of their architecture. Their distinct names like Darocha, Peregrino, Morton, Da Costa has become commonplace in both Popo Aguda and in Accra. Many of these Afro-Brazilian slave returnees built a number of buildings. They were trained as builders of Baroque architecture in Brazil, bringing the legacy of Afro-Brazilian craftsmanship and patterns of living that are still prominent in the Brazilian Quarter in Lagos, in Popo Aguda, and probably to a lesser extent in Accra, Ghana. They built civic buildings, you can just zoom in, mosques, churches, and homes. We can go to the next one. Yes. So if we go back, so the house on the left, Casa de Fernandes, or is known as Ilojo Bar before it was demolished in recently. The family, the Olaya family, purchased the property from the Fernandez family in 1933. It has ornamental pilasters and prominent window arches. Most of the glass and balcony doors have been replaced by wood or wrought iron. For the 160 something years that it stood regally at the corner of Tinubu Square, it was a vibrant communal center for the Afro-Brazilian community in Lagos. On the right, the Vaughan House, which was built for James Churchill Vaughan, who was a Nigerian doctor and political activist. This was sold eventually into a building for commercial purposes in 1900. But it was built by an Afro-Brazilian architect for James Churchill Vaughan. With that prominent Baroque doorway and those arches, these were signatures of Afro-Brazilian architecture in that region. Of the religious buildings that were built, the Shitabe Mosque, which was the religious learning center and one of the oldest mosques in Nigeria. This was named after its founder, a Sierra Leonean-born Nigerian Muhammad Shitabe, who was an aristocrat, philanthropist, and businessman. The Afro-Brazilian architect, João Baptista da Costa, oversaw the construction, which was done with signature tile work depicting Afro-Brazilian architecture. So while these examples in Lagos are much more prominent, we're looking at a home in Accra that was given, we can go to the next, that was basically given a strategic location on the coast, in between the British and the Dutch forts, James Fort and Usher Fort, respectively. And the siting of that home in the lower left corner reveals much of the middleman position held by the Tabon economically and sociopolitically. The arrival of the Tabon, as these 7 Afro-Brazilian families in Accra and their descendants have come to be known as, occurred during a period when coastal Accra was divided into Dutch, Danish, and British territories. They were seen as modern men and women and became fully integrated into the host society of the Otubluhungans in Dutch Accra. With their backyards oriented towards the Jamestown fishing harbor, which was the gateway into West Africa for a long period of time. It was a strategic point of entry and departure for trade up until the mid 20th century. And their fronts that were directly accessible by Jamestown, Old Accra's main streets. By virtue of their location, they were drawn deeply into the workings of both an overseas and local trade. The son, who was the leader of the Tabon group at the time, and you can see him with a top hat on the left, Nia Zuma Nelson. He was the eldest son of Azuma Nelson, and his name was Nia Lasha. He was a successor and a very close friend of the Ga King Taki Tawia, who you can see in the middle with the white beard. And together they they enabled the development of a wide range of commerce in the area. This picture talks about the unique entrepreneurial niche in the 1850s and 60s that was witnessed in Accra, of chiefs, go back, local businessmen and small traders working through and for European parties in Accra. And this drastically changed over time as the trade in people slowly declined to the trade in goods. Next slide. In less than the span of one generation, we saw the influence of Afro-Brazilian architecture. We can see Brazil Lane littered with whitewashed structures and some 2-story structures, which marked the transformation of 1-story villages of thatch roofs and mud walls into 2-story towns. The Afro-Brazilian house and infrastructure represented a progressive symbol of modernity and a reflection of the economic situation of their time. And so that initial 1-story structure that Brazil House was, we don't have evidence of that today, was transformed into a 2-story structure that we'll be seeing in a minute. Next slide. The Tabon appealed to the Ga court, the Ga chiefs, through their spiritual leader, Mahama Sokoto, and they were also granted land in the interior, stretching from the Valley Fanofa to Ajabeng. So the land that they owned on this coastal strip, which was residential, was supplemented by agricultural activities on the interior. And this reflected the topography of Accra and its striking binary. The coastline was ideal for fishing and mercantile activities, whereas the inland remote region was great for farming. Marked by trees, unique trees delineating the extent of their land, the Tabon began farming at scale. 40 years of living on Brazil Lane and farming on the interior had seen the expansion of Mama Nasu's family through the union of his daughter to a royal member of the Otubluhum Ga royal family. And his grandchildren began to grapple with their dual identities as Otubluhum Gas and Afro-Brazilian Tabon. This generation of the Nasu family witnessed the dawn of a profoundly different Accra, the nature of its furious expansion causing them to adapt in ways characteristic both of Ga and Brazilian society. Within the walls of the house that the Nasu family grew up in, the earliest structure, which we do not have evidence of, we are able to understand the plans and the structure of the building today through probably the photograph from the 1980s that recount what was the original house plan. So this shows, the sort of plan where we have 3 bays, on each side with a central hallway in the middle. And this was a very distinct plan that had not necessarily been seen in the surrounding towns in Dutch, British, or Danish Accra. Up until the 19th century, most of the houses, both in Accra, were compound and courtyard houses that centered around an open courtyard or a small atrium. When we take the top off the homes, we see this arrangement of space that are concentrated around the hallway as the link between Afro-Brazilian architecture and what we see in Accra and Lagos. We look to the painting from a series of illustrations of Brazilian architecture known as the Markgraf map, which renders the most accurate cartographic representation, offering a panorama of Brazilian life in the 17th century. In the painting's background, or the illustration's background, the plantation house is raised on its pillars, and it's depicted behind the one-story structure of a sugar mill where the enslaved are working. On the second floor of the house, the owner calls out to someone below who is standing now far from a group of slaves and the enslaved, who appear to be performing dancing and clapping activities that are obscured from view. The activities occurring around the plantation scene show the intersection between work and domestic space and the proximity of slave owner and the enslaved. A closer look at the architecture of these buildings, which isn't covered here, depicts the forquilha posts commonly found in Upper Guinea, as well as the Portuguese arch, suggesting a distinctive domestic architectural style that has evolved through the interaction of Portuguese, West Africans, and Luso-Africans on the Upper Guinea coast in Portuguese Brazil. Whereas the Upper Guinea homes were a symbol of social status among both Portuguese and Africans, it was the less wealthy members of the 17th century Brazil that were built in a style reminiscent of what we're seeing today. The urban enslaved population in the 19th century inhabited generally two building types: the sobrado, a building 2 stories tall, and the terreo, the same plan built only to 1 story. The fundamental difference was their flooring. The terreo house were made of chao batido, a form of rammed earth, and the sobrados were typically of stronger material and were used as shops or commerce, to house shop or commerce activities. They could also be used for the accommodation of animals or the enslaved. These houses were built in a uniform manner and were aligned with the limits of the public road, their hallway forming a 90-degree with the public artery. And this took advantage of light seeping from the street in the front of the house, allowing it to penetrate deeply into the alcovas or rooms, as well as enable air circulation, which was difficult to achieve. In interviews with the current members of the family who still live in the current home, one can begin to piece together, furthermore, how economic control, home-based enterprise, and the relationship of home to the harbor behind them influenced their family occupation patterns. While Alfred Lutrot, living at the house at this time, maintained his job as a tailor in Ushertown, Dutch Accra, his wife Adelaide contributed to the upkeep and the running of the household through entrepreneurial business of selling fish. During the fishing season in Accra, she would hire about 10 fishing gangs from Fantiland to engage in large-scale fishing activities. Once she obtained the fish, she would personally sell, smoke, and handle all of the tasks around accounting, dividing the rest of the profits among the fishermen. And so her control around the courtyard, this practice known as aprodo, that was often run by the head women of the household, contributed a substantial and generated a substantial amount of income to sustain the house for the rest of the year. Together with other women in Old Accra, Adelaide formed a flourishing entrepreneurial class of women in both small coastal towns whose economic wealth was buttressed not only the control of finance, but by their matrilineal kinship systems. The stability of the residential pattern enabled them to maintain a sort of apprenticeship system dominated by women, the older sister or daughter living in close proximity with her mother, as we see on the ground floor, that was completely dominated by women. And they would learn through living rituals how to run home-based enterprises. Edward J's exploration of localization as one that is derived from multiple origins and shaped according to the demands of a locality is important. Here we see an emerging relationship around the hallway and the surrounding rooms in the urban Terreo Sobrado in Brazil, the houses in Lagos as well as in Accra. While the facades of the Aguda homes give an interesting narrative about how motives and design changed, imparted a symbol of modernity and class in Lagos society, it is actually the house plans and the configuration of space from above that reveals that undeniable link in terms of organization around and in relationship to the hallway. While the simplicity of Mama Nasu's home, the Brazil house, disguises its function in Jamestown, we see in plan view over time how the expansion of the property around the house around the property shows a subtle localization to the Akan courtyard architectural tradition. Kofi Akwa, who was the grandson, spent his time as a flourishing chef in the city of Warri, coastal city of Warri in Nigeria. And upon return to taking up the head of household, he built 3 structures around a courtyard, initially open only to the coast. The main house in the north and 2 residential structures on the sides. And this arrangement, reminiscent of Akan compound houses, is incredibly unique to Accra, where circulation, unlike those in Yoruba culture, are brought to the center, into the interior of the courtyard. In understanding his renaming of the home into Warri House during that period, we also see how he capitalizes, you can go to the next slide, on other types of economic activities in order to support the family. It is assumed that Kofi Akwa was influenced by the Brazilian Nigerian home. You can go to the next one, which is probably linked with parallel notions in going to the 2-story structure of power, self-esteem, and that image of Afro-Brazilian architectural identity. But it is also does not discount in the way that the house expanded around the courtyard, the influence of the Akan courtyard homes, as well as the Atubluhungans in Jamestown. In the courtyard, the fishermen would deposit their catch directly from the beach. After a day out at sea, and Adelaide would orchestrate a large wholesale activity. Her son, who describes his mother's economic enterprise proudly, recalls a direct passageway between many of the homes on Brazil Lane to the actual harbor and beach below. Over time, and in order to navigate the changing economic climate, the Tabon and many of these homes began to maximize their strategic position near the coast and the harbor by leasing or selling their valuable properties, dividing it into smaller spaces for rent. Originally built with this reddish brown stone and bounded by a local clay mortar, the architecture of the original walls of Brazil House have come to withhold pieces of local and transatlantic history as it changes with time and who occupies it. It is believed that these were quarried off from an interior location, and that stone was brought to the coast to comprise many of these homes, including that of their neighbors, Franklin House, that we can see above. Over time, the family traces the urban future of the city when the head of the household, William Lutrot, moves with his family to Tema, the new industrial town and industrial harbor, in light of a prestigious civil service job, leaving the Brazil House to other members of the Nassau family. Over the next 30 years, the physical structure of the house begins to deteriorate as the household composition and those who occupy it increase. By 1999, we know that there were 84 tenants living in the structures of the Brazil House property. In June of that year, various local and global actors within Accra came together to embark on a rehabilitation project to restore the architecture of Brazil House, and in doing so, as we can see, ascribes new futures to the building. We see the deliberate attempt of the architects that was eventually chosen to be a Tabon architecture firm to draw on inspiration from its neighbors, incorporating the decorated arts that we see in Franklin House next door. We also see the covering of that original stone with plaster that was painted a bright yellow and green. The funding of the actual rehabilitation comprised of local actors, the Gamanshi Redevelopment Authority, the Tabon community, the Tabon chief, as well as private companies in Accra and Brazil, including Coral Paints that supplied the facade renovation that we see. Propelled by the Brazilian President Lula's visit in 2005, the endeavor was set into motion by the Brazilian embassy in Ghana, who acquired support from private sector, the Brazilian and Ghanaian private sector, and working in conjunction with the Tabon community, they helped reshape and install a museum on the ground floor of the house that recounted a history of the Tabon families in Accra. The material culture of the house expresses memories and probably projects new ones beyond those of the current owners, embodying unintentional prosthetic memories of lived-in histories. In the restoration of the Brazil house by these actors, we see how the history of a group of Tabon elite is staged to embody the imagined pasts and futures of two nations, Brazil and Ghana. As our subject, the Brazil house is a middleman, withholding and releasing information held within it, and at times resisting the forces that try to impose change onto it. The narrative that emerges is one that oscillates alternates between causal relationships between the life of a house and that of its wider urban environment. In thinking about how to develop narratives stemming from domestic architectures, one might think of employing a critical geography of architecture, which shows two directions: how the home relates to the larger social and cultural orders of the city, which in turn penetrates back across the threshold into the dwelling and social occupation behind closed doors. And with that, I'm going to end and actually welcome a mentor and historian, architect and archaeologist, Professor Henry Wellington. Are we able to spotlight him? Fantastic.
Yeah. Mae-ling, I'm now with you.
Fantastic, welcome. So this conversation that we're about to have is actually goes both ways. I'm asking Prof questions and he's asking me questions. And I'd sort of like to start off with one that, we've sort of discussed over the years. The Brazil house, relative to other homes that we've studied, is quite unique. Many of the families and houses are faced with important challenges in documenting them, even in terms of their family trees, and the lack of official records and documentations from birth certificates, photographs labeled unidentified person, to property titles that don't necessarily show the extent to which these families own land. So, Prof, in thinking about methodology in the context of today's discussion, how have you sort of rethought the ways in which knowledge can be collected and held in order to trigger further research or other lines of investigation?
Yes, thank you very much, Mae-ling, for your question. Let me start by first commending you for a very brilliant presentation you've made this evening. It's very, one a very good feeling that you did a good study of the Brazilian house and also the Brazilian culture in Accra. I'm very happy that you've been able to put this together in the context of the domestic world making by the enslaved people. I'm very, very happy about what you've done. Now, to your question, I will not be able to directly relate my ideas to the Brazilian situation in Accra, because as you know, I've studied the Brazilian situation in Accra very extensively. What I've done is more of Osu, about the Danish Osu people. But learning from that, I want to first say that the attempt I've made, to generate knowledge and build knowledge, respect to study of the past, respect to architectural development, has to do with interaction with the people who occupy the spaces where we want to know more about. So oral traditions and oral history form a part of my study, which I believe that could be a basis for people like you to continue. So we need to have a good understanding of what oral traditions are, and what oral history is, with respect to our work as architectural historians and architects who want to know more about what has happened in the past in terms of the spaces which we study. Now, oral traditions, as explained by the late Professor Akwanda, a very profound archaeologist, oral traditions deal with information which have been gathered in the past, which have been retained in the memory of family members, and which have been passed on. Now, this type of information is important for me, in trying to understand, the architectural issues related to buildings in the past, in the areas which we have been studying, because the information which we derive from what have been by relatives, by uncles, by grandparents, and for that matter, by ancestors, have to be taken quite seriously. But of course, we need to analyze them and relate them to other sources of information for us to come to good conclusions about what this information we are deriving from oral traditions should be to us. Now, it's also very important that our work should be influenced by information which is derived from oral history. Oral history is the history given by people who have literally experienced what they're talking about. And when it comes to the built environment, those who live in the houses, those who live in the buildings, have grown. Many of them were born in these houses, and they've grown, and they've seen a number of things which have been left behind as relics, which have been explained to them. So when they talk about their experiences, we have to take them seriously, because they are objects of truth, which we can use to do further work. So my point is that in our work, we should count a lot on both oral traditions and oral history, because it become a very good launching pad for us to go forward as we do further research. Now, in addition to oral traditions and oral histories, sources of information which are obtained from family records generally are very important for us. Records which have been made as a result of what either grandparents or great aunties and uncles have written down, especially when it comes to celebrating the dead, what we make reference to, in Ghana as obituaries. Obituaries become very good source of information for people like us to analyze, to be able to understand the things which have happened in the past, because the names people who come up in the obituaries have histories on themselves, And we need to know those the histories of those people who are mentioned in the obituaries, which will be used for us to do further work. Now, in addition to sources of information from the families, the church, in which are found in the communities where we are studying, will become very important source of information for us, because the church does keep records of families and of the communities. Sometimes this information will go into the archive, but for us as researchers, it will be necessary for us to go to the church records, the archives, to, as it were, try to excavate the information there, which are put in these records, which will be used for us, by us, to be able to advance our research. So I believe that as researchers, in the built environment, when we are looking at the past, it's necessary for us not only to count on oral traditions and oral histories, but also to count on records which come from the church. Now, from experience, I've also known that you can go beyond the records we find in the churches. By going to a cemetery, for example, in the cemeteries, you may find a number of pieces of information on tombstones, which we can use, to understand the things that happened in the past about the individuals who may live in the houses where we are studying. So, Mae-ling, these are the areas in which I believe that I can share with you in terms of how one can advance one's research work in the area of the built environment when we are looking at the past.
Thanks, Prof. And it leads to another question, which deals with maybe truncated truths or competing stories. We know that obituaries, which you mentioned, project an image, a story that the person writing it wants to convey. And so how have, and this also pertains to the Brazil house and the architecture, in the final stages of the home, it's plastered, and covered. And that covering of the original stone and mortar is incredibly important, because that scale of building thick walls and the amount of labor that is used links to their past, where they became slave traders as well. So these complex or competing histories, or truncated truths that are told by one side of a family or one side of a community will by and large come up. And so, we're thinking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you've dealt and engaged with these contested truths, contested knowledge and accounts. We're also thinking about that especially as we grow the grapevine and how we actually visualize these competing truths.
Yeah, this is a very important dimension of our work. And we'll be able to make meaning of what you do when it comes to when you are dealing with bricks and mortar. Photographic records of these become very important source of information which one can analyze and make conclusions out of it. I was trying to see whether some of the pictures, the photographs you projected could give me a hint on what is alleged to have happened among the Tabons, the returned Brazilians. I wasn't able to see them, but I was able to see a little clue in terms of the picture you sent or you projected about Ni Azuma sitting down together with the Ga chiefs. If you recollect, they were all in traditional clothing. Only Ni Azuma, one of the first generations of the returnees, was in a British dress with a top hat, maybe with a tailcoat. I could see this from the picture you sent. Now, for me, that confirms the allegation or the perception that yes, these returnees engaged in slave trading, the internal slave trade, which had been going on at the time they came to the Gold Coast. Now, why am I saying that? The dress form of Azumah indicated to me that this was a person who was aping the Europeans who began the transatlantic slave trade. We are the offshoot into the internal local slave trade. He dressed up in the way in which he did to show, for me, an indication that, yes, he was still not, although he had returned to the motherland, he was still a slave master. He was dressing like them. Because if he had turned his back on the experience of slave trading in Bahia, he wouldn't have dressed up when he was having this formal kind of interaction with the chiefs of Accra. So my point is that photographic recordings are very important for our work as architects who are engaged in historical study of the built environment. We must be able to look very critically at pictures which we come across and analyze them to come to some conclusions. So what I would say in response to your question.
Thank you, Prof. It maybe leads to a final question. At the scale of the home, and even the way you just talked about analyzing how one's dress and fashion communicate their role, in society, that every small decision in fashion, in the arrangement of a building that is so responsive to the economic, social, and political forces of their time, it might read a very different, yield a very different way of reading the home in close concert with what's happening. So in going into details, because you have this unique position as an archaeologist, an architect, a historian, to you, what are the exciting knowledge gaps between agriculture, architecture, archaeology that we need to look at?
Yeah.
Or at least in your work.
Yes. From the experience I've had so far, the information gaps had to do first and foremost with the people who created the architecture. What sort of people were they? What were they thinking about when they created the architecture in which they lived? We don't have information on that. Then another information gap is those who actually worked to erect the structures. The masons, the carpenters, the roofers. We don't have information on them. But they were key players in making of the architecture. So when we want to know the history of the spaces which they created, we should know also about them. But we don't have information on that, right? Then those who brought the materials on site, if you like it, the labor force. Were they women? There were men who were digging the stones, who were shaping the stones. What sort of people were they? What were they thinking about when we were working on those materials? This information is very difficult to come across, or has been very difficult for me to come across in my studies. Now, so my point is that we need to then go to other sources, which will take us then into further archival studies beyond what we see. And sometimes it may be necessary for us even to go to foreign archives to be able to get access to the information, to be able to have a full picture of the people, the materials, the way we need to build, and so on and so forth. Because if you take, for example, the case of the Danes, they have very good records about the people who worked for them, the type of enslaved people, men and women, where they have come from, the local people, those who have come from the interior, and so on and so forth. The Danes have records about them. So the point I'm making is that to be able to get a total picture, which will include those who worked, who produced, those who carry the materials, sometimes it's necessary for us to go to foreign archives to get information. That's what I did, studying the history of the buildings in Osu, because of the fact that the Danes had records of this, and I got some of the information from the Danish archives in Copenhagen.
Thank you, Prof. I think in writing your book, Stones Tell Stories in Osu, we see a wealth of examples of where one may go to find and supplement some of the local pieces of knowledge that you've acquired, and obituaries, for one, is so important. There's a question from Adedoyin Teriba, who's been doing fantastic work on the architecture of the Aguda in Nigeria, as to some extent in Benin. And he's asking, what information have you uncovered about the individual architects and artisans among the Tabon? And that probably relates very well to what Prof was just describing, who built these homes, who built these buildings, what materials and skills did they nurture over time in order to build. And in relation to the Brazil house, I haven't been able to uncover anything about the actual builders. I think more so with the forts and the larger architecture, slave infrastructure architecture, that is somewhat, told. Even my own family, you look at the houses that were built around the forts, and typically you'll find people who were involved in the building of it. My family, the local family, were builders and were involved in the building of the Christiansburg Castle. And I think that's something I haven't necessarily explored, in relationship to Brazil. Lane, a lot of the family members had, especially the ones that were well-to-do, had left to other parts of the coast, to Tema, to Nigeria. And so that's something, we'll probably have to delve into. What I do know is that the eventual architect that was chosen for the rehabilitation was Tabon, Padu Nelson. And they have some information, going to the actual architecture firms, particularly in these high profile projects. We might learn something about the artisans and the builders. Presumably, the first structure was designed and conceived of by, the head of family, Mama Nasu, and other leaders like Mahama Sokoto in the Tabon community. I apologize for having to cut this short, but Adedoyin, it would be amazing to learn about what you've uncovered in terms of oral history or traditions about some of these architects in Lagos, as well as the entire construction stakeholders, those who built as well, and that we can integrate that as well into the grapevine. So thank you, Prof. Thank you for the questions. And with that, I'll end and move on to introduce the speakers in session 4.